Hi folks, welcome back to Empire of the Sun. Tonight we are going to talk about amphibious assault. I think most of us probably consider amphibious assault to be sort of the bread and butter of any Pacific war game, and Empire of the Sun is no different. It also tends to be a somewhat more complex sort of concept and set of mechanics in most games, and it is in Empire of the Sun as well. I'd say it's probably one of the more fun but also one of the more challenging pieces of the game. And so we want to take a little bit closer look at it. And I think, again, as with a lot of the game system, it just is easier to comprehend if you can just follow along with a few examples. To start with, let's do a quick definition. Amphibious assault in Empire of the Sun actually is one of two forms of movement by which ground units can move over ocean hexes. It's basically amphibious assault or strategic ground transport. Those are the two options. Interestingly enough, the one thing, well, a couple things they actually both have in common. One is that the units that can amphibious assault can also strategically ground transport. Those that can't. So basically you have two classes of units, those that can move by sea and those that cannot. The units that cannot move by sea are essentially the Dutch and the Chinese, as well as, more importantly, the Indians. It can be tempting sometimes to say, oh, let's take that reduced Indian Corps and have it amphibiously assault Rangoon, but that doesn't work because the Indians are not allowed to move by sea. And again, that goes for both strategic ground transport as well as amphibious assault. So let's talk about the difference between the two. Strategic ground transport basically is any sea movement by a land unit that involves the land unit moving to a friendly port. So it's real simple. Just remember, if you're moving a ground unit to a friendly port, it counts as strategic ground transport, and what is important is that you don't need amphibious shipping points for that. If you are moving by sea to any hex that is not a friendly port, you're using amphibious assault. That's the distinction, clear and simple. And amphibious assault requires amphibious shipping points, typically either one or two, depending on the unit. The Japanese Korean Army is a special case and takes a bit more. But in general, keep in mind, strategic ground transport, you're moving to a friendly port, you don't need amphibious shipping points. If you're not moving to a friendly port, you're amphibiously assaulting, even if you're not attacking anybody. Note that with strategic ground transport, if you are moving not only to a friendly port, but also from a friendly port, that is, you're moving between two friendly ports, the ground unit, as can naval units, will be able to move double. So, for example, if you're using a 2OC, the normal naval movement on a 2OC would be 10 hexes. The ground units can also move 10 hexes, but if a ground unit is moving between two friendly ports, it can actually move double, that is 20 hexes. The other thing to keep in mind that is common between both modes of sea movement is that ground units are never allowed to move through an unneutralized enemy ZOI. They either need land-based cover from their own land-based air ZOIs to neutralize the enemies, or they need a carrier escort. And remember, if you have an escorting unit, you're not allowed to pick up or drop off. So basically, for a carrier to escort a ground unit through enemy ZOIs, it would have to both start and finish its movement with the ground unit. So now let's take a closer look at amphibious assault. The Japanese and the Allies are a bit different. For the Japanese, amphibious assault tends to occur in the early part of the game. The Japanese are moving as fast as possible, but often unopposed or with fairly light opposition to their amphibious assaults. The Allies tend to, and that, by the way, that goes for both ground and naval air. So in other words, the Japanese, there are not too many cases where the Allies can intercept the Japanese in the first couple of turns with any kind of force that could potentially do any damage or stop the amphibious assault. That's quite different from the Allies in the mid-game when they're just trying to get cranked up and make progress of war in turns 4, 5, and 6. It's very often the case that the Japanese air naval forces are quite strong and could potentially win the air naval battle, which would cause the amphibious assault to be repulsed. So there's that piece of it. And then on the ground, again, early in the game, with one exception, the Japanese will rarely come up against any strong opposition, whereas the Allies in the mid-game and in the late game as well will usually have some fairly strong opposition that they have to be thinking about on the ground. So they're different. Let's talk first about the Japanese in the early game, and then we'll spend more time on the Allies in the mid and late game. For the Japanese in the early game, you'll notice this is the 1942 scenario start to the campaign. So basically the Japanese have already got positions in the Philippines and they've moved down into Malaya. There's a couple of situations where it's worth talking about amphibious assault. The big one is sort of over here. If you take a look, Tlaatjap is the major Dutch stronghold, and that 612 Dutch division there is a pretty tough nut. And so the Japanese normally won't want to amphibious assault it, but it can be useful to just talk for a minute about why, because that'll help set up some of the conversation later when we talk about the Allies and what they will or won't want to go against. Let's just for starters here, let's do a typical emergency naval move. You'll remember the Allies get an emergency naval move at the beginning of the game. We won't do all of them, but we'll just do a few relevant ones here. This is fairly typical play for the emergency naval move. Often the Dutch cruiser squadron will come over here and cover Surabaya. And you may remember from the earlier video, the main purpose for doing these emergency naval moves is to create speed bumps that require the Japanese to have more battle hexes than they would otherwise have. So if we look now, it's not unusual for the Japanese to be seeing an air unit covering this Dutch regiment, probably no naval unit there. But even so, if you look at it, and this is also a mixed text, by the way, let's just toggle the pieces off for a second so we can be clear. Sometimes with new players there's some confusion because there's an awful lot of this very light green looking terrain. So sometimes people think that maybe that's the clear terrain. Actually, that's mixed terrain, which is fairly nasty terrain. Back to looking at the situation at Tlaatjap. There's a Dutch regiment which has an attack strength of 6 and a defense strength of 12. And you'll recall that, let's assume for a minute that the Japanese will win the air-naval combat. That's not too much in doubt. It is really important, though, because when your amphibious assault is also a battle hex, which will often be the case, you must win the air-naval combat in order for the assault to be able to go forward. If you don't win the air-naval combat, then your assaulting ground units will be turned back and you have no chance to conduct ground combat in the hex. Whether they can actually destroy the Dutch air unit to get air supremacy is an open question. You'll recall that you get +2 to the die roll if you have naval supremacy, which means the offensive player is the only player with naval forces left after air-naval combat, and you get an additional +2 if you have air supremacy, meaning the offensive player is the only player with air forces left after air-naval combat. So the offensive player can get up to +4. He should have +2 here for naval, but whether he can get +2 for air or not is an open question. So if we assume that we win the air-naval combat and we look at what could happen in ground, let's look really quickly here at the combat results chart. And the CRT is here. And you'll notice that there's a +3 modifier for the reaction player if the offensive player uses amphibious transport. That means if he's conducting an amphibious assault. So, and that occurs if the defender had ground forces in the hex already. If there were no ground forces in the hex to begin with and they only reacted in, then the reaction player won't get the +3. But as long as there were some ground forces in the hex to begin with, the reaction player will get +3 to his die roll. It's also important to remember the other big deal in amphibious assault is that the assaulting player's defense values are halved. So if you look, for example, at the Japanese units, they are 12 defense strengths per step, and those will be halved to a 6. So if you go back now and think about what it takes to win a ground combat, and winning the ground combat means that the attacking player keeps the hex. If the attacking player doesn't win the ground combat, then he doesn't get to keep the hex. And in the case of an amphibious assault, that means that his assaulting ground forces have to do an emergency naval move home, basically, or a post-battle movement home. So for the assaulting player to win an amphibious assault, there's a couple of options. One is, if he completely destroys the defending forces in the hex, the defending ground forces, and has some steps left over, he'll maintain control of the hex or take control of the hex after the amphibious assault is over. The other possibility is if the defender loses more steps. That's the normal method to cause the defender to have to vacate the hex, is if the defender loses more steps than the attacker. And so if you'll look, you'll notice this is a two-step Dutch regiment. It doesn't have a bar on it right now, so that means we should be able to flip it over. And indeed, we can flip it over, and you can see that the backside is a 312, and it's got the light-colored bar there. So it's a two-step unit. So if the Japanese can kill both steps and have anybody survive, they can take the hex. Or if they can eliminate one step and lose no steps themselves, then they can hang on to the hex. Well, even to kill one step here, they need a combat result of 12. So let's assume that the Japanese conduct the assault with a full-strength 1812 army, like the one that we're looking at here. And if we look at the combat results chart, and let's also assume that the Japanese have a +2 modifier for naval units, for naval supremacy, that offsets the -2 modifier that they get for defender in mixed terrain. So there's a 0 DRM. With 18 factors in attack, a 1/2 result is going to mean a 9. That's going to yield 0 steps against the Dutch. 1 result is going to yield 18. That's enough for the 12, so that would get 1 step against the Dutch. So there's a 70% chance that the Japanese will do 0 or 1 steps of damage against the Dutch division in this assault. You'll recall, because the Japanese are halved here, that 1812 is actually a 6 on defense. If the Dutch get a 1 times result, that's 6, that's a step. And the Dutch are actually going to be at +3 here. That's going to mean that even a 0 is going to be a 3. That'll be a 1 times result. And so basically there's no way that the Dutch are not going to get at least a 1 times result. And so that means that really with just an 1812 assaulting, the Japanese actually are going to have to do 1.5 times or better and destroy the Dutch unit. And they've still got a pretty good chance they'll lose at least 1 step, if not 2, in the assault. Not to mention the fact that they're spending a couple of amphibious shipping points. And keep in mind that the Japanese right now in this particular scenario that we've defined are only coming with 2 steps. And so if the Dutch actually take out both of those steps, which they have a 40% chance to do, then even if the Dutch are also eliminated, the Dutch will still retain control of the hex and the amphibious assault will fail. So if you work all the odds, it actually turns out that the Japanese, if they come with only 2 steps of amphibiously assaulting units and have a 0 net DRM, they've only got an 18% chance of being successful in this assault. They could improve their odds by sending a 3rd step along, but that takes an extra amphibious shipping point, and it also still has a very high chance of, well, they're going to lose at least 1 and a 40% chance of losing 2 steps. So you can see, even though this is just one lowly Dutch division here, it's strong enough that it's basically going to be able to put up quite a fight, and the Japanese really are not going to want to amphibiously assault this hex. Typically what they'll do is they'll conduct an amphibious assault into Batavia. They'll normally do that with just 1 unit. It could be, most likely would be a 912, a reduced strength army, which would take 1 amphibious shipping point with just enough air or naval force to either destroy the destroyer squadron or just cause it to lose the combat, in which case it would have to retreat. But if the Japanese grab Batavia, if we move this out of the way, Batavia is a port, and the Japanese can then move in an extra couple of steps at no cost, because you remember, if we move from a friendly port to a friendly port, it doesn't cost us amphibious shipping points. So the cheap way for the Japanese to take Chelatjap is basically to take Batavia with 1 ground unit then ship in a couple more steps with strategic ground transport, and then march over land. And when marching over land, they're not halved anymore on defense, and the Dutch don't get that +3, and so it's just a much safer bet all around. That gives you a sense of why the Japanese normally won't conduct an amphibious assault against Chelachat. What they will often do, though, is they really don't have much choice but to conduct amphibious assaults against all these little Dutch regiments that are scattered around. And these Dutch regiments are more like police forces, really, than significant military forces. They're only one step, actually, so we only have to get one hit on it to kill it. And let's take a look at what we might use to do that, and let's look at the difference between mixed terrain and jungle terrain. Typically, we would be thinking about going after one of these Dutch regiments with a reduced strength army. We always like to conduct amphibious assaults with a reduced strength army if we can, as the Japanese, because it takes less amphibious shipping points that way. It's 1 versus 2. The 912 going up against this guy here, let's just assume for a minute that we have 0 die roll modifiers. So let's assume again that we've got +2 for either air or naval, but not both, and that cancels out the mixed terrain. So with a 0 die roll modifier, what that's going to mean is we're still going to have a 30% chance of failing to kill the Dutch unit. If we get a 1 times result or better, 1 times 9 is 9. That's more than enough to kill 6. And so on a 1 times result or better, that is on a 3 or higher, the Japanese will eliminate the Dutch regiment. The Dutch regiment, with only 1 attack factor, can't do any damage to the Japanese unit at all, no matter what it rolls. But a Japanese unit with only a +2 for air or naval superiority to balance out the -2 for mixed is still going to have a 30% chance of failing to take that hex, because they're not going to do any damage if they roll too low. So we can improve that, and a typical way that the Japanese would improve that is actually to send a CVL along with the unit, and actually a good CVL to send is sitting right here, and it often would go actually perhaps with that unit. But if the Japanese send a CVL and it's in the hex, you'll notice 2 things. These CVLs are nice. CVs are the same. They count both as naval and air. So in this situation here, the CVL provides +2 for naval superiority and +2 for air superiority. So that's a +4. That offsets the -2, so there's a net +2 die roll modifier. So what you can see is if you roll a 0, +2 is 2. So actually a 0 still gives you a 1/2 times result. So even with +4 for the CVL, there's still a 10% chance that the Japanese will fail in this amphibious assault. But that's pretty good odds, and the Japanese are normally quite happy to go for those, and every now and then they'll miss one. The other situation, if we look at Balikpapan, the die roll modifier for jungle is only -1, not -2. And therefore, with +4 for naval and air supremacy and -1 for terrain, that's a net modifier of +3. So the Japanese will be successful 100% of the time going against a jungle hex. So as you look at the places the Japanese are going to want to be invading, there's jungle and a regiment up here, jungle and a regiment here, although sometimes it's actually you just land, let's say in Banka, and move overland there. You can, by the way, move overland between those 2 hexes. This is a jungle hex. So the jungle hexes, if the Japanese deploy a 912 reduced strength army and a CVL to support it, or some form of naval and air support for a +4, they'll get a 100% chance. But against a mixed terrain hex here, they're going to still only have a 90% chance. Those are just some basic odds and things to think about as you're conducting amphibious assault as the Japanese in the early going. In talking about the Japanese here, I've pretty much ignored all the complexities. So, for example, I've completely ignored the possibility of any reaction. And for the most part, that's reasonable, because the Japanese should be shutting down the Southwest HQ in Manila and the Malaya HQ in Singapore very early on. But you do have the SEAC HQ up here. And so there are certain circumstances. For example, if the Japanese conduct an amphibious assault over here against Medan, and they do it with a 2OC or higher value card, in other words with a 2 or a 3, then SEAC potentially could cause some reaction over here that could reach Medan and could create a problem if the Japanese don't have sufficient escort. So that's something to keep in mind. If you have paratroopers, Medan is a good place to grab with paratroopers. Otherwise, if you got a 1 OC value card, you can use that, or you just need to make sure you've got enough of an escort. Let's switch over now and talk more about the US in the mid-game. This map setup is actually the start of the 1943 short scenario. It's turn 5, and you can see that the Japanese have fairly strong forces in the Central Pacific here. The U.S. have just retaken Guadalcanal. This is a typical situation where the U.S. finds itself in a position of needing to make progressive war and needing to conduct some amphibious assaults along the way. There are really, again, two things that the U.S. or the Allied player is going to need to think about. One is, can I win the air-naval combat? And then secondly, if I win the air-naval combat, can I win the ground combat? And more specifically, for both of those, what are my odds of doing that? A really fundamental question is simply, can the Japanese player react at all? In some cases, he'll be able to react. In some cases, perhaps not. And in some cases, he may be able to react if he can get a special reaction battle hex declared. So let's talk for a minute about sort of what those scenarios look like. I've just put up the ZOIs here. In general, if you are conducting an amphibious assault against a hex that is defended, there will always be some chance for reaction. It could either be by a card achieving intercept, or it could be by die roll achieving intercept. But a defended hex is a battle hex, and there will be a chance for intercept. So in all cases of defended hexes, you need to consider that intercept is a real possibility. If the hex is not defended and not under an enemy ZOI, then there is no chance for intercept. So if we look over here right now, Palau, Yap, Ulithi, all these hexes back here, Marcus and Iwo Jima, all those hexes are basically free for the Allies to grab if they've got the right card to do it. The Japanese can't react to that. There are a couple of issues. One is the Allies are going to have to escort their forces through Japanese ZOIs, which is not trivial. Then there's always the possibility that the Japanese, if the Allies were to grab Palau or Ulithi right here, which would be nice for a port in the rear, unfortunately the Japanese could throw up a couple of air units and immediately isolate anybody who's back there. So that's usually not a good early grab, although technically these are free and open hexes that the Allies could grab with no problem. The third situation is hexes that aren't defended but are under a ZOI umbrella. So if you notice all of these hexes here in the Solomons, Admiralty in particular, since that's a nice port that the Allies would like to grab, and all the bases over here and the air bases in the Marshalls, those are undefended, so they aren't going to automatically be battle hexes, but because they're under ZOIs, there's an opportunity for the Japanese to try for special reaction. And so basically they have to achieve special reaction using a standard intel roll, and then they also have to have intercept, which they could achieve either through a die roll or a card. So that's sort of an intermediate scenario. You've got a better shot at sneaking in without having to fight a battle if you go that way, but there's still a chance if you're going in under a ZOI that the Japanese could get a special reaction on you and then be able to intercept. Some other important considerations: can he bring additional ground forces in reaction? If the other player, in particular the Japanese in the mid-game, if he's under ISR, then he won't normally be able to bring anybody but the small naval brigades in reaction. So we've got one out here who unfortunately doesn't have a ship with him, the one on Wake. So at the moment, you can see the Japanese aren't very well set up for reaction with their naval brigades because their naval brigades don't have any naval escorts with them. And you'll remember that one of the important rules in amphibious assault, both in offensive amphibious assault and in reaction amphibious assault, is that you cannot move into a hex with an enemy naval unit unless you bring your own naval escort. Normally the Allies will be escorting their forces with naval units because they don't want the Japanese to move a naval unit in reaction and immediately defeat it. So the Allies have got to escort their amphibious assaults with naval units. That will mean that the Japanese can only send in a reaction force that's also escorted, so that means they've got to have their naval forces stacked with their ground forces that are going to be reacting so that they can provide that escort. So that's one of the things the Japanese will have to do in the early part of the 1943 scenario, is set themselves up a little bit better to provide some escort availability. But with the Japanese under ISR, they've only got the possibility of moving smaller naval brigades in reaction. If they're out of ISR, they have the opportunity to move a larger reduced strength army. And remember that you can only use one ASP in reaction. So you basically the Japanese can react into a hex using amphibious assault with one reduced strength army, and that will be it. But that often is enough to make a difference, so the Allies need to think very carefully about whether that's a possibility or not. In addition to that, if the Allies are under ISR, they're going to have some limitations as well. They're not going to be able to use U.S. Army forces in amphibious assaults in conjunction with naval forces. The rule is that ISR doesn't prevent Army forces from amphibiously assaulting, but it does prevent them from being activated along with naval forces, other than there are a few cards that have a MacArthur's Navy special rule that allows the activation of one naval unit. But in general, it's a lot harder to amphibiously assault with U.S. Army units if the Allies are under ISR. The other aspect of the U.S. Army is it's got the one hex island restriction, which basically says that if you are a U.S. Army unit, you can only amphibiously assault into a one hex island if you're doing it right behind a Marine unit. You can't do it any other way as a U.S. Army unit. So let's take a look now at an actual situation in the mid-game. This is turn 7. The Allies are looking for an opportunity to grab their bomber base. If you look here, you'll notice that Marcus, which is within 8 hexes of Tokyo, is defended only by an air unit. It doesn't have a ground force there. Iwo Jima, in this case, has nothing on it at all. So the Allied player has an opportunity. And although the bomber base doesn't need to be taken until the end of turn 8, and this is turn 7, it's one of those cases where you just never know what kind of a hand you're going to have. The Allied player has some cards this turn that can pretty much ensure that he's successful in taking the bomber base. So he really wants to take advantage of that right now and not take the chance that on the following turn he might not have a good hand. And in fact, what he's going to do here is go after Marcus, and let me pull up the activations and show you what that's going to look like. Looking at the Allied plan here, the first thing you'll notice is that the card chosen is Halsey's Carrier Raids on Japan. This is a nice card for a couple of reasons. First of all, it has a logistics value of 8 if it's used with Central Pacific, which is a quite high logistics value, which is great. So combined with Central Pacific, it'll be good for 11 activations. It's also got a nice bonus. If during the offensive a U.S. aircraft carrier participates in a battle in a Japanese islands hex, the Japanese basically are going to lose a card from their hand unless they can weather this. Now the trick is it's a 2-0C, which means that the U.S. can only move his forces, his naval forces, 10 hexes to do that. And at this point, the only U.S. naval forces that are actually capable of moving 10 hexes and then attacking a Japanese islands hex are at Biak. And unfortunately, you'll see that Biak is at extreme range, and because of the Japanese ZOIs here, Central Pacific is not going to be able to activate forces at Biak right now until those ZOIs are cleared out of that area. So the Allied player can't really use the card for the bonus, so he's decided to go ahead and use the card with all the activations as a pretty much foolproof invasion of a bomber base at Marcus here. And so what he's done is he's got the 1st Marine Division coming in. So you'll notice Kwajalein here is a base for the U.S. It's been captured on a prior turn, and the Marine Division was there along with a battleship and a couple of carriers. So that's the base that's launching the attack, the primary attack here. But the U.S. has also got a bunch of additional carriers here. This is the first turn that the big fleet is on, because this is the game in which the U.S. is deep in the hole in war in Europe, so everything's been delayed. And so the Navy's, even though the Navy can't get sent to Europe, it's still delayed a turn. So this is the main attack here, and the idea behind all the forces here is the U.S., the Allied player has made sure that there's enough U.S. naval forces there that no matter what the Japanese react with, they won't be able to do sufficient damage. The primary reason for making these two attacks is to pin those potential reaction forces, because the Allies don't want either of these reduced strength armies here. You'll see there's one there with the CVL, and there's one there with the Shokaku, either of which could be, if they weren't pinned, could potentially be escorted into this hex and fight on defense. And so that would not be a good thing. So those two potential reaction forces are being pinned. The potential reaction force here at Truk, you'll notice there's a CVE with another reduced strength army, so that's being pinned as well. You'll notice these two armies, the Allied player is ignoring them because they don't have naval escorts, so he doesn't have to worry about them. This unit here doesn't have a naval escort, and essentially all other ground units either have no naval escort or they're too far out of range. So basically what the Allies have done is they've made sure that no defending ground forces can be moved into the island hex in reaction, and that they have an overwhelming naval superiority if the Japanese were to try and react to win the air-naval combat. So with, needless to say, with that card, it's pretty much of a no-brainer win for the Allies, but it was important that they look at the potential ground reaction and make sure that no units could come in reaction amphibious assault. I want to look now at another example and get more into the thinking behind the planning for an amphibious assault. And I've got a specific example here that's quite interesting because it packs a bunch of things into one card play that's actually not, on the one hand, it's not too complicated, but on the other hand, it's got a lot of subtlety behind it. And the background on this game actually is this is the game that we've been seeing on and off throughout. It's a game that's in progress, and actually for those who are curious, this is a game between Antero Kusi and myself. Antero is a really great player, and it's fun playing him. He's the Japanese in this game, and I'm playing the Allies. This is the game where the Japanese had a really slow start due to some pretty poor cards in the first couple of turns, but they did have some excellent War in Europe cards that were used to put the Allies way down here in the red territory. The Allies have finally, just in the last turn, gotten out of the area where they're losing their amphibious shipping point. So when you move from here up to here, you regain your amphibious shipping point reinforcement. So you'll notice we're in turn 8, but the Allies actually only have 4 ASPs. They have had booze, but they haven't actually had a reinforcement since turn 3. So the Allies are finally in a position where they've got to make 4 progressive war hexes. And one of the things that's happened over here in the Solomons is that by choice, I took Rabaul knowing that I took Rabaul actually relatively late compared to when I might have, knowing that I really wanted to save Guadalcanal because basically at this point with 1 ASP, if I take Guadalcanal, I'm going to actually get these other 4 hexes as well. So essentially with 1 ASP, I'm going to be able to make all the progressive war for the turn. That'll leave me 3 ASPs left to try and pull off whatever other havoc I can. At the moment, the Allies are also under ISR. You'll look up here that the Allies have been under ISR almost for the entire game as well. So, in fact, that's part of what makes this such an interesting game is the Allies have been deep in the hole in War in Europe and also under ISR almost from the start. And from the perspective of sort of how do you play a situation in the mid-game, where you have some challenges, this is probably a good example. So this whole scenario is one that I think will be great in terms of looking at from a little bit higher level of operational planning on a turn-by-turn basis, and I'll do that in a future video. But for right now, let's just take a quick look at a really interesting amphibious assault scenario. So the idea here is to go after Guadalcanal. The primary mission, and it's always good to have a primary mission in mind when you're conducting an amphibious assault. The primary mission is taking Guadalcanal. We're early in the turn. That will ensure progress of war for the turn, and then enable the Allies to sort of figure out whatever else they want to do with their remaining amphibious shipping points. And in particular, if they can get out of ISR, that might make things a little more fun. The card that we're going to use to do that is Tradewind. This is 4 if used with Southwest Pacific, so 4 plus the 2 for Southwest will be 6. 6 activations is more than enough and gives us some opportunity to do some other things too. So the first thing we want to do is ensure that we can have a successful amphibious assault at Guadalcanal, and to do that, because we've got a half-strength Marine division, half-strength Japanese Naval Brigade, all we need is a U.S. Marine division, because even with a half times result, that's going to kill the Naval Brigade, and the Naval Brigade's not going to be able to do any damage in return. So we actually don't need any other support in this amphibious assault if we can manage to avoid any possibility of reaction. Now you'll notice that this is a 2OC on Tradewind, so the Japanese are going to be able to come from 10 hexes away. So there are some possibilities for Japanese reaction. So we need to look at that a little bit. But one of the things that we should check here quickly is you'll see that at this point, Truk and the South Seas HQ in Truk does not have a ZOI. And the challenge is the Japanese are starting to get low on air resources, and so they've pulled back a little bit. So there's no ZOI here. So one of the things that means is that if I am able to take a CV and let's just show these activated, and if we look at our ZOIs, if I've got a ZOI over Truk, at this point the South Seas HQ is going to be out of supply, and so the South Seas HQ is not going to be able to react to this hex. And Combined Fleet and South HQ are, neither of those are in range of this hex. We do have to look, though, at the fact that we've made Truk into a battle hex and whether that allows reaction by anybody else. And if we go up here and take a look at Combined Fleet, one of the things that you'll notice is that Combined Fleet is actually Ozawa, not Yamamoto. That's because Operation Vengeance has been conducted. Yamamoto is gone, so Combined Fleet is now 12-2 instead of a 13-3. And the implications of that, there are a couple. One is that Combined Fleet no longer reaches up to Atu Kisco, which creates problems for keeping somebody in supply up there. But it also doesn't reach down to Truk and Biak, for example. So particularly in this case, Combined Fleet can't react to an attack on Truk because it's not within Combined Fleet's range now that it's reduced. Let's turn that off and go take a look at South. And you'll notice South obviously is well out of range. So we're okay. We've made, let's just turn the ZOIs back on. So we've made an attack on Truk to put it out of supply so it can't react to Guadalcanal, and we haven't created any additional problems by doing that because Combined Fleet is Ozawa and is not able to react to our attack at Truk. So we've got 2 activations, 2 battle hexes here, and we've still got 4 more activations to go, and so the question is, can we have some fun someplace else? We'd actually love to try to pull off an amphibious assault over here at Kendari if we could. The one challenge with that is that it is under a ZOI, so there's a possibility of a special reaction. We do have, if you look here, we've got quite a good stack here. The 2nd Marine Division is there. So if we were to activate them, they would be able to amphibiously assault here. Now, you'll notice that I'm amphibiously assaulting into a ZOI, which requires a ZOI of my own to cover it. If I didn't have the Marine Air Wing there, I'd need a CV for an escort. But because the Marine Air Wing is there, I'm okay with ZOI coverage all the way in there. But we do need to worry about the possibility of, for example, Nagato, or there's a CA in this hex here. Either of those could react, and a naval unit reacting in here would cause a failure immediately. And so we actually will need somebody like this battleship to go in as a close-in support in the invasion hex to fight off anybody who might come trying to kick us out. The other thing we need to look at is we've got, so far we've taken 1, 2, 3, 4 activations. We've got 2 more to support the combat. We do need to win the air-naval battle as well, and so we could send these 2 guys. Let's show that they're both activated. Those are 2 Essex-class carrier groups. So that uses up all 6 of our activations, and it provides 44 strength for this particular invasion here, which has a pretty good chance of holding off anything the Japanese might throw at it if we had a really bad result. If the Japanese actually had a card, a counteroffensive for reaction that allowed more than the 3 that they would normally get, because if you look here, they're going to get in reaction, if they can react, they're going to get 1 for south, and they're going to get 2 for trade wind, so they would be able to react with 3. But if they were able to actually react with 1 or 2 more than that, then we might have a problem sustaining the air-naval combat here. You also might be asking, well, gee, that's not a battle hex right now. Why are you worried about that? Just, you have to remember special reaction here. We're going in under a ZOI, it's a base, and therefore the Japanese will have a chance to roll for special reaction. If you look over at the card here, you can see under, since we're using it as an event, we have to use the EC intelligence number. That's a 4. We're going in under a ZOI, so that's a -2. So that means the Japanese will be able to get a special reaction here on a 6 or less, which is a 70% chance. And even if they don't have a card and still have to roll for intelligence, they'll get intercept on a 70% also, because it'll be the same roll. And so basically they've got a 50-50 shot of being able to both declare a special reaction hex here and be able to intercept it. So if, and could be a better chance than that if they've got a card for intercept. So it's a bit risky. If you like playing risks, you can go for that because it's not the primary objective. The primary objective is over here. But it's definitely a bit risky if you're worried about wasting an ASP. You might also hope to pull out Nagato in a couple of units in anticipation of being able to kill him, and whether the Japanese would react to that or not is an interesting question. But in this particular situation, there's actually another problem, which is by creating the possibility of a battle hex here, which we've said is there's a 70% chance that the special reaction would be successful. That creates a battle hex. If the Japanese are then able to react, it would be with south. If we look at south's range, one of the things you'll notice is that Palau and the Zuiho there are actually within range. That means that the Zuiho and possibly the 17th Army could be activated by south in response to a battle hex being declared here. Now the rule is that once south activates Zuiho, it can go anywhere it wants. So south has to be within range of a battle hex, just one, and it can activate anyone within range of the HQ. But then whoever's activated can go fight in whatever battle hexes they can reach. So that means the Zuiho could go fight over here at Truk, which we don't really care about because there's no impact from that. But the Zuiho might decide to sail on down to Guadalcanal. If you count, you'll notice it's a little too far. We've only got 10 hexes we can move. So that means the Japanese can't use the 912 and react amphibiously with the 912, but they could send the Zuiho. And if they sent the Zuiho down here, with no air naval support for the Marines, the CVL would automatically win that battle, which would be insta-failure for the amphibious assault. So we're actually going to need some escort here. And if we send our own CVL down there, then you'll notice that even if the Zuiho got lucky, because it's only a 6 against this 10, so it would need a critical hit. If it got lucky and flipped the CVL is still a 7, even if the CVL doesn't damage the Japanese at all, he still wins the air-naval combat by 7-6. So this guy, because this is really the only possible reaction that can reach, this guy is enough of an escort to fend that off and prevent the Japanese from trying that. But what that means is we now have an extra unit over here. We've got 3 units already activated over here for the primary mission. That means we have to pull one of these guys out. So now we're down to 30 strength over here supporting this amphibious assault, and 30 strength is starting to get really dicey here. There's a good shot that the Japanese could activate enough strength to turn back that amphibious assault in air-naval combat. And so we probably don't want to go that route because there's no point in having too good of a chance of wasting an ASP. So let's deactivate that Marine, send them back, say let's not go with that Marine. We're not going to do an amphibious assault there. But if we send the Marine back, then that gives us the opportunity to decide to go ahead and activate one of the, let's get him out there, come on. So what if instead we went ahead and attacked the Japanese air unit there. The nice thing about that is that if we take out the air unit, then we've now opened up Kendari to a free shot because there's no longer a ZOI over there. Either that or the Japanese have to send in air from somewhere else to cover it. But as you can see, they don't have air to spare, so it's going to be a tough decision, and they're more likely to probably leave it uncovered. So we'll see how that goes. But this is actually a good shot for the Allies because with 44 here in this attack, the Japanese are not likely to want to respond to that because they're basically becoming at the Allies one-on-one in a situation where the Allies have the +3 die roll modifier for U.S. air. That's just really bad news for the Japanese. So we probably will get a free shot at taking out this air unit, which will free up that port to be attacked on a future card. So that looks like it's about the best we can get out of this particular card here. What I've done is just kind of walk through a lot of the thinking that goes on in trying to figure out how are you going to pull off an amphibious assault, and in particular thinking about what's your primary mission versus what's your secondary mission, and ensuring that your primary mission can be successful at the same time that you look to try and pull off some other fun stuff if you've got the activations available to do it. Anyway, this is an interesting card just because it's not a big card, only 6 activations, but there's a number of subtleties that all sort of come out in the conversation here, which is why I wanted to share this particular example with you. We're back here now in the start of the 1943 scenario. It's turn 5, and I thought it might be useful to talk about just some general rules of thumb for the Allies, and particularly the U.S. in the Central Pacific especially during the mid-game, but these really apply across the entire game. And so let's look at the different types of ground units that can be defending in a hex. And let's start with full-strength Army in 1812. If you look at Rabaul here, there's an 1812 there at the beginning of the 1943 scenario. And the basic rule of thumb against an 1812 is don't. There's just no way. You need to bypass it. It will do too much damage. If you look at it on a 1x result, an 1812 does 18, and if you remember, your defense strengths are halved, so 1 step only takes 6 damage to kill. So an 1812 on a 1x result is going to kill 3 steps right out of the chute. And it's going to have a 40% chance because of the +3 of having a 2 times result, and a 2 times result is going to kill 6 of your steps. And that's just totally prohibitive. So as the Allies, you absolutely cannot afford to amphibiously assault against a full-strength army. By the same token, the Japanese will never try to amphibiously assault a full-strength U.S. corps. If you want to go after a base that is defended by a full-strength army, about the only option you have is to try to get rid of any Japanese ZOIs that are covering that base, get your own ZOI over it at the end of the turn so that it's basically out of supply during attrition. That'll cause it to flip. It'll then be a reduced strength army, and you've now got a shot at it. But that's really the only way you can go after a full-strength army, is to try and reduce it through attrition first and then amphibiously assault. Well, okay, I lied. There is actually one other way you can go after a full-strength army, and that is if you can catch it naked, meaning it has no air or naval support, then you can bombard it with your air and naval forces in that combat phase. Then you can have a good shot at reducing it, and once it's reduced, then you can your amphibious assault is coming after it as a 912 rather than 1812. But to do that, you got to be absolutely sure that you're going to be able to catch it without support and reduce it, because if they manage to react, if the Japanese can react, then you're not going to be able to bombard the ground unit. It'll be at full strength, and it'll absolutely destroy whatever you send after it. So that's pretty risky and only works in some fairly unusual circumstances. A 912 is going to do 3 steps of damage against you 40% of the time, because remember, with the +3, it's going to have a 40% chance of getting a 2 times result. 2 times 9 is 18. Since you're halved, that's 3 steps. So you're going to lose 3 steps 40% of the time, and 2 steps 20% of the time. And so you will always need 2 units, either a Marine division and a corps. Well, that's typically either 2 Marine divisions or a Marine division and a corps would be the normal mix. And you still have to ask yourself, is it worth going after? Because essentially, you could lose easily 3 steps, and it's going to take you 2 or 3 ASPs to do it, depending on your choice of units to go after it. And so there will be times when you have to take out a reduced strength army, but you don't want to be doing it on a regular basis. You want to try and bypass those to the extent possible as well, because again, it's quite expensive to go after them. So you got to pick your battles there very carefully. Brigades are a different story. The brigades, there's the South Seas Brigade here, which is a 6.6 at full strength and a 3.6 on its backside. And then the rest of the brigades are 4.6 on their full strength side and a 2.6 on their reduced strength side. The quick rules of thumb are that against a reduced strength brigade, going in with a Marine division, you're always going to win. It's not a problem. You don't have to worry about it. As long as you win the air-naval combat, obviously, you will always win the ground combat, because even on a half-times result, you're going to get 6, which will eliminate the only step in the unit. And so basically it's a no-brainer. If the brigade is at full strength, if it's a 4.6 brigade at full strength, meaning it's got 2 steps, then it gets a little trickier, and it really depends on what kind of modifiers you can bring. Basically, if you're going up against a 4.6 with a 0 net die roll modifier, you've got about a 90% chance of winning on the ground if you work out the odds. If you've got a +2, that goes up to about 97%. If you're at -2 because you don't have any air or naval support and you're going in against mixed terrain, then you're down to about an 85% chance of actually winning the hex. And I'm not talking specifically about how many losses you take here. I'm just talking about winning the hex one way or another. So there's a really good chance against a full-strength 4.6, but it's not a sure thing. And against the 6.6 at full strength, it's a lot less so. If you're at -2 against the 6.6, you've only got about a 2/3 chance of taking that hex. It goes up to about 79% if you got a 0 net modifier, and you're up around 93% if you've got a +2 die roll modifier, just to give you a rough idea. So the 6.6s are a bit tougher, and while the 4.6 at full strength can do a step against you if it has a 1.5 or 2 times result, the 6.6 is going to do a step against you if it has a 1 times result or 1.5 times, and it's actually going to do 2 steps against you if it gets a 2 times result. So again, you have to think about the potential losses, and ways to mitigate those are to try and put the units out of supply first so that you can reduce them in attrition, and then they're a lot safer to attack once they've been reduced by attrition. So that's Amphibious Assaults. Thanks for joining, and next time we'll talk about planning out a hand for the turn in the mid-game for the Allies.